Welcome, the Lord's chosen. Every realm went silent. Then heaven stood up. That's not poetry. That's a spiritual broadcast that played across dimensions the moment you made your last move. You didn't even realize what you triggered. While you were questioning if you did the right thing, angels were somewhere clutching their wings like, finally, they got it. See, science says every human action releases a frequency, a vibration that ripples into unseen spaces. But when a chosen one moves in divine obedience, that's not just a ripple. That's a seismic event in the spirit. Your last decision, the one that looked small, strange, maybe even stupid to the crowd, was actually a cosmic chess move. It altered timelines, closed demonic tabs, and rewrote destinies. Heaven doesn't clap for noise, it claps for alignment. And you, yes, you, did something that broke a system. You didn't flex your power, you redirected it. That's why the applause didn't come from humans, but from angels who've been waiting centuries for that moment of obedience, that unannounced shift, that internal "I'm done living beneath my calling." Funny thing, you probably thought you were just minding your business, maybe sipping tea, deleting contacts, or saying no to something that used to own you. But from heaven's point of view, it was the equivalent of dropping the mic in the middle of a spiritual courtroom. This is Chosen Ones. The angels gave a standing ovation for your last move. Because sometimes the smallest earthly step shakes eternity. Number 1, you chose alignment over applause. There's a rare kind of silence that comes when you stop performing for people and start moving with purpose. That's the silence heaven listens for. The moment you quit chasing approval, you entered a new spiritual frequency, one that only truth can survive in. People didn't understand it because they were used to your availability, not your authenticity. But something in you clicked. It's better to be misunderstood in alignment than celebrated in confusion. You didn't reject applause because you didn't deserve it. You rejected it because it came from the wrong audience. You realized clapping hands can't guide destiny. Every cheer that doesn't echo your calling is just noise. When you walked away from validation, you weren't being proud. You were being purified. You started choosing what matched your spirit instead of what fed your ego. And that's when heaven took notice. This was never about arrogance. It was about accuracy. You weren't trying to prove you were right. You were trying to stay real. That shift, quiet as it seemed, sent shock waves through the unseen. Heaven stood not because you became popular, but because you became precise. The applause you lost on earth was the ovation you gained in eternity. There's a kind of peace that comes when you no longer need the crowd's yes to obey God's go. You stopped explaining your growth, you stopped auditioning for acceptance, and you finally understood that obedience doesn't need an audience. What you did was sacred rebellion, not against people, but against everything that once made you betray yourself just to be liked. Heaven didn't stand because you performed well. Heaven stood because you stopped performing at all. You chose truth over trends, conviction over convenience, and that alignment, not applause, became the loudest statement of your purpose. Number 2, you stopped negotiating with what was sent to destroy you. There comes a moment when survival stops being about endurance and starts being about boundaries. You reached that point. You stopped entertaining what drained you, stopped justifying what broke you, and stopped calling chaos complicated. That shift wasn't loud, but it was final. It was the kind of move that changes everything without needing a witness. Heaven noticed because you finally refused to bargain with the very things that were designed to bury you. For too long, you tried to fix what was meant to finish you. You gave explanations to people who never listened, patience to situations that only took, and loyalty to dysfunction disguised as love. Then one day you woke up and realized peace doesn't require persuasion. You stopped negotiating with your old self, with guilt, with manipulation, and with every voice that told you to stay small. That's when your deliverance began. What made this moment so powerful wasn't that you walked away, it's that you didn't look back. You stopped reasoning with red flags. You stopped shrinking your light just to keep toxic people comfortable. You learned that silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. The very moment you decided that enough was a full sentence, heaven erupted. Angels stood because you finally passed the test, the one that demanded you choose purpose over pressure. You didn't need revenge, closure, or validation. You just needed release. You understood that not every battle is worth bleeding for, and not every connection deserves a comeback. That's maturity on a spiritual level. The enemy lost power when you lost interest. You cut the cord to everything that kept you in emotional debt, and that freedom became your victory song. Heaven didn't celebrate because you fought harder. They celebrated because you finally stopped fighting what was never meant to stay. Number 3, you didn't just endure the storm, you decoded it. Most people survive pain, only a few learn from it. You didn't just go through the storm, you studied it, broke it down, and uncovered the message hidden inside it. While others complained about the chaos, you started seeing the pattern. You realized that what was attacking you wasn't random, it was instruction in disguise. The hardship was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to train your discernment. Heaven took notice because endurance is common, but understanding is divine. You learned that storms don't come to prove your weakness. They come to expose your readiness. Every delay, every betrayal, every closed door began to make sense. You saw that pain has a language, and you finally became fluent. That's when the whole thing shifted. You stopped asking for the storm to end and started asking for the wisdom to walk through it correctly. Angels stood because you didn't waste your suffering. You translated it into strategy. What made this moment powerful wasn't that you survived, but that you changed perspective. You began to see that every loss was a lesson, and every disappointment was direction. You recognized that God was never punishing you. He was promoting you through process. The storm was a classroom, not a curse, and you graduated quietly without needing applause. People who only endure storms stay bitter. Those who decode them become builders. You took what tried to break you and used it as raw material for your next season. You stopped fighting the rain and started harvesting revelation from it. That's why heaven stood. Not because you came out dry, but because you came out different. You turned confusion into clarity, pain into purpose, and endurance into enlightenment. You didn't just survive, you evolved. And that evolution was your thunderclap in the spirit. Number 4, you rewrote the contract of pain. Pain had a contract on your life, a silent agreement that said, every time this hurts, you'll break. But you tore that agreement to pieces. You stopped letting pain define you and started letting it refine you. You didn't deny what you went through, but you refused to stay there. That's what made heaven stand. You turned what was supposed to poison you into the very ink that rewrote your story. Most people get stuck trying to make sense of why pain happened. You went deeper. You asked what pain was trying to teach you. That's when everything shifted. You began to see that every wound carried a lesson, every scar carried strategy, and every tear watered something sacred inside you. You stopped resenting your past and started mining it for revelation. What once embarrassed you became the evidence of your becoming. Your suffering didn't make you hard. It made you honest. It stripped away your illusions and left only truth standing. You realized that healing isn't forgetting what happened. It's removing its permission to control you. That's maturity at its highest form. You began to transform your memories into manuals, your heartbreak into higher awareness. The very pain that tried to end you became the foundation for your strength. Heaven didn't applaud because you stopped hurting. It applauded because you finally understood what to do with the hurt. You became an alchemist of emotion, turning grief into growth and wounds into wisdom. That's rare. That's divine intelligence at work. You no longer see pain as punishment, but as preparation. You rewrote the contract when you decided that nothing you went through would go to waste. Every experience now serves a purpose. Every scar now speaks truth. And every moment of breaking became proof that transformation is real. You didn't just heal. You negotiated with destiny and changed the terms. Number 5, you mastered stillness in the midst of exposure. You reached a point where defending yourself became unnecessary. When God started revealing who you really were, He also revealed who everyone else truly was. That kind of exposure doesn't require a reaction. It requires restraint. You learned that silence can speak justice in ways words never can. You didn't rush to clear your name or prove your purity. You let discernment do the talking. That's a level of discipline only the chosen understand. You stopped explaining your growth to people who preferred your confusion. You realized that some will always misread your transformation because they benefited from your brokenness. The more you elevated, the louder the whispers became, but you refused to descend just to explain why you were flying. You discovered that stillness isn't weakness. It's sacred strategy. God was your spokesperson, and your peace became your proof. Heaven stood because you didn't let exposure drag you into performance. You could have clapped back, you could have exposed back, but you chose posture over pettiness. That choice rewrote your spiritual authority. You started to understand that divine elevation will always come with misunderstanding, and not everyone has the capacity to interpret what heaven approves. While others were busy reacting, you were being refined. Stillness became your strength training. Every false story became irrelevant in the presence of undeniable favor. You no longer needed to convince anyone of what was obvious to God. That calm you carried wasn't indifference. It was insight. You understood that peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the mastery of response. Heaven's applause wasn't for your silence. It was for your self-control. You stayed grounded when gossip tried to shake you. You stayed poised when proof would have been easy. And that level of spiritual composure echoed louder in eternity than any argument ever could. You didn't win by shouting. You won by standing still. Number 6, you became the proof that delays are divine design. Every delay in your life once looked like denial. You watched others move faster, win sooner, shine earlier, and for a moment you wondered if you were behind. But heaven wasn't ignoring you, it was aligning you. The waiting season was never punishment, it was precision. While you thought nothing was happening, everything was being prepared to unfold at the exact second it would matter most. That's divine timing, and you became living proof of it. People called it stagnation because they couldn't see the synchronization. They measured your progress by speed, but God was measuring it by substance. You weren't being delayed, you were being developed. You weren't missing out. You were being molded into someone who could handle what you once only prayed for. The waiting room became your training ground, and your patience turned into power. You moved when heaven moved, not when humans pressured. That discipline broke spiritual cycles. You stopped chasing timelines that weren't yours. You stopped comparing calendars and started trusting divine rhythm. Every "not yet" protected you from premature exposure. You learned that early success can destroy what only mature strength can sustain. The delay didn't deny your destiny, it detoxed your motives. Heaven stood because you finally understood that timing isn't about when, it's about why now. You mastered the art of divine pacing. You refused shortcuts, and you stopped mistaking stillness for stagnation. You realized that sometimes God holds you back, not because you're not ready for the blessing, but because the blessing isn't ready for you. When your moment finally came, it came with weight, not hype, but authority. And that's what terrified darkness. You arrived rooted. You didn't just get there, you grew there. The delay wasn't wasted. It was the divine process of making sure you could carry what you were created for without collapsing under it. Number 7, you buried your old self without a funeral. There was no dramatic goodbye, no farewell post, no explanation. You simply decided to evolve. You stopped rehearsing your history and quietly walked into your higher self. The death of who you used to be didn't need candles or condolences. It needed courage. You didn't wait for anyone to understand it, applaud it, or validate it. You just knew something had expired in your spirit, and keeping it alive was costing you peace. That moment of private transformation shook the heavens more than any public performance could. You buried your old self without bitterness. You didn't hate the past version of you. You just outgrew them. You stopped needing permission to change. The same spaces, habits, and conversations that once felt comfortable started feeling too small. You didn't argue with it. You honored the discomfort and followed the growth. People may have thought you fell off, but you were really being resurrected in silence. Heaven stood because resurrection doesn't need witnesses, only obedience. True transformation is personal. It doesn't require applause or advertisement. You didn't owe anyone an explanation for your evolution. You simply released the weight, the wounds, and the version of yourself that survived seasons you no longer live in. The shedding wasn't pretty, but it was pure. You let go of identities that were built on pain, defense, and survival. You stopped answering to names that no longer described your nature. Every part of you that used to shrink for others was laid to rest, and from that burial, your authentic self rose without needing validation. Heaven's ovation wasn't for your silence, it was for your surrender. You didn't announce the transformation, you embodied it. The old you was necessary but not permanent. And when you finally walked away from your own past, that was the loudest resurrection heaven had ever witnessed. Number 8, you didn't seek revenge, you chose revelation. There's a power that comes when you finally realize not every battle deserves your sword. You reached a level where revenge felt beneath you. Instead of clapping back, you stepped back, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. You stopped proving your purity to people committed to misunderstanding you. You let peace speak where pride used to shout, and that silence became your loudest victory. Heaven stood because you didn't just rise above the drama, you evolved beyond the desire for it. You learned that exposure is God's department, not yours. What was said about you didn't require defense, it required discernment. You allowed elevation to become your evidence. You didn't waste energy trying to fix rumors that were never meant to be corrected. They were meant to be contradicted by your results. That's revelation. Understanding that vindication doesn't come through retaliation, but through manifestation. The moment you stopped seeking revenge, you became untouchable. You discovered that real strength isn't found in striking back, but in staying still long enough to let truth catch up. You stopped needing closure from chaos. You realized that revenge may satisfy the ego, but revelation feeds the soul. What once hurt you started teaching you. Every betrayal became a blueprint for wisdom. Every attack became a lesson in awareness. Heaven doesn't cheer loudest when you win an argument. It cheers when you refuse one. The higher you go, the less accessible you become to offense. You no longer operate on the same emotional frequency as those trying to provoke you. You traded reactions for revelations, and that exchange shifted your entire spiritual atmosphere. Your calm became a threat. Your peace became proof. and your ability to walk away without resentment was heaven's confirmation that you've outgrown the battlefield. Revenge fades. Revelation transforms. You chose transformation, and that's what made heaven rise to its feet. Number 9, you moved in silence, but heaven echoed your steps. There's a different kind of power that comes when you stop announcing your next move and start aligning it. You reached the place where you no longer needed to explain your process or post your progress. You understood that destiny works better in private. While people were waiting for proof, heaven was already hearing the sound of your obedience ripple through eternity. Your silence wasn't empty. It was electric. Every quiet decision was a declaration that only the spiritually tuned could feel. You started realizing that not every act of obedience needs an audience. Every no you whispered to temptation, distraction, or ego triggered a yes in heaven. Angels took note not because you performed perfectly, but because you chose correctly when no one was watching. That's what real power looks like. Unseen discipline that produces visible destiny. You moved differently. You learned that exposure isn't progress, and that announcing vision too soon can attract interference. So you mastered the art of doing the work without demanding attention. You built in silence, healed in silence, prayed in silence, and transformed in silence. That silence wasn't weakness. It was warfare. Every step you took in private echoed louder in the spirit than any public display could. Heaven stood because you didn't seek applause. You sought alignment. You learned to let God reveal you instead of rushing to be seen. The quiet moments of faith, the secret prayers, the unnoticed sacrifices, those were the sounds heaven responded to. Your silence became a symphony only heaven could hear. When the time was right, your results spoke, and they spoke in a language louder than words. You didn't just move quietly, you moved precisely. You didn't hide out of fear, you hid to mature. And when you finally stepped forward, heaven had already echoed your arrival. Number 10, you humbled your ego without humiliating yourself. There's a sacred balance between confidence and surrender, and you found it. You didn't let pride drive you, but you also didn't let false humility shrink you. You learned that lowering your ego doesn't mean lowering your worth. You stopped needing to be right all the time and started focusing on being aligned. That shift changed everything. It wasn't loud, but heaven heard it. The moment you bowed internally, God crowned you spiritually. You didn't lose your power. You finally learned how to wield it with grace. Humility became your secret weapon. You realized that submission isn't slavery, it's strategy. It's how the strong reset their strength. You stopped reacting to everything that challenged your image because you no longer needed validation to feel valuable. You let peace win arguments your ego would have ruined. You walked away from competitions that didn't match your calling. That's wisdom disguised as calm. You didn't humiliate yourself to stay humble. You simply stopped overvaluing pride. You learned that ego feeds on attention, while humility feeds on awareness. Every time you chose patience over proving a point, heaven took note. You became the kind of person who could be trusted with more, because you weren't ruled by applause or offended by correction. That's maturity, not the absence of strength, but the mastery of it. Heaven stood because humility is the gateway to divine authority. You discovered that real kings and queens don't need to shout to be seen. Their stillness speaks volumes. You carried yourself with quiet confidence, knowing who you are without needing to announce it. That posture of humility opened doors pride would have slammed shut. Your ego wanted validation, your spirit wanted elevation, and your spirit won. You didn't bow to weakness, you bowed to wisdom, and that single act of surrender became the crown heaven placed on your head. Number 11, you finally chose legacy over likeness. You stopped chasing relevance and started chasing purpose. That was the shift that rewrote your entire destiny. You realized that fitting in was never the goal, it was the distraction. You were never meant to blend into rooms built on trends. You were sent to rebuild them on truth. The moment you chose to stop copying what was popular and started creating what was prophetic, heaven erupted. Angels stood because your focus moved from being seen to being significant. You understood that likeness feeds the moment, but legacy feeds generations. You stopped obsessing over who noticed you and started asking who will benefit from what you're building. That's the difference between fame and fruit. While others were chasing algorithms, you were planting principles. You traded attention for assignment. You didn't care if the crowd clapped because you were building something that time itself will respect. This decision wasn't about ego, it was about endurance. You knew that doing it God's way wouldn't always go viral, but it would last. You started creating from a place of conviction, not competition. You refused to be another echo in a noisy world. Instead, you became an original sound, a voice that carries generational weight. That's what legacy looks like. Impact that doesn't expire. Heaven rose because you chose the long game. You didn't need overnight success when you were called to eternal influence. You stopped needing people to remember your name and started working to make sure they remember the truth you carried. That's spiritual maturity, when you understand that the reward isn't likes, it's lineage. Your last move didn't trend, but it translated. It reached into your bloodline and broke patterns you didn't even start. You didn't do it for applause, you did it for alignment. You finally understood that legacy is louder than likeness, and heaven stood because you built something that will still speak long after your name is whispered. Number 12. You exposed darkness without announcing war. You reached a level of spiritual maturity where you no longer needed to declare every battle. You understood that true warriors don't waste energy making noise. They let their presence do the talking. You stopped matching dark energy with anger and started disarming it with peace. What looked like passivity to others was actually power under control. You didn't need to fight back because light doesn't argue with shadows. It simply shines until they disappear. That's why heaven called it victory. You didn't have to expose anyone. Truth did it for you. You didn't have to retaliate. Revelation handled that. You mastered restraint, knowing that some attacks exist only to bait you into lowering your frequency. You stayed still, but everything around you began to shake. The same darkness that tried to intimidate you had to acknowledge your immunity. You became untouchable, not because you fought harder, but because you operated from a higher plane. You understood that sometimes silence dismantles what shouting can't. Your calm defiance confused every enemy that expected chaos from you. You learned to let time testify and results reveal. That's the language of those who walk with authority. They don't announce war, they embody victory. Heaven stood because your discipline became your defense. You fought smart, not loud. You turned every attack into evidence that your peace is a weapon. You didn't react to what was thrown at you. You responded with wisdom that made darkness back away in disbelief. You didn't have to curse it, clap back at it, or expose it. You outlasted it. That's how heaven defines triumph, not by who shouted the most, but by who stayed standing when the smoke cleared. You didn't fight fire with fire, you became fireproof. And in that quiet confidence, heaven saw not a survivor, but a victor who conquered without ever declaring war. Number 13, you proved that obedience is the loudest miracle. It's easy to obey when everything makes sense, but your obedience came from a place of faith, not comfort. You said yes when logic said wait. You followed direction even when you didn't have details. That's not weakness. That's spiritual mastery. Heaven stood not because of what you accomplished, but because of what you surrendered. You proved that the real miracle isn't in what you receive. It's in the courage to stay aligned when everything in you wants to run. It wasn't your talent that shook realms. It was your submission. You obeyed when it was inconvenient, when it cost your pride, your comfort, and sometimes your company. That's what separates the called from the chosen. You didn't need to understand every step. You trusted the one who ordered them. That kind of obedience echoes louder than any public victory. Heaven celebrates those who say yes in secret more than those who perform in sight. Your yes broke spiritual patterns. You refused shortcuts, you ignored pressure, and you stopped trying to negotiate with divine timing. You learned that obedience isn't about agreement, it's about trust. Each time you obeyed without seeing the reward, heaven recorded it as faith in action. Angels don't cheer for fame, they cheer for alignment, because alignment sustains what blessings only start. That's why your life shifted. You didn't need to prove your worth. Your obedience proved your identity. Every act of surrender was a statement that said, I trust divine order more than my own understanding. And in that posture, power moved. Heaven didn't stand because of what you gained. It stood because of what you refused to lose, your alignment. You showed that miracles aren't always visible. Sometimes they look like stillness, discipline, and saying yes when no would have been easier. You turned obedience into your loudest worship, and heaven responded in applause. Number 14, you became the answer you were praying for. There comes a moment when the waiting ends, not because the answer finally shows up, but because you realize the answer has been you all along. You stopped begging heaven for rescue and started embodying the strength heaven placed inside you. You stopped saying, when will it come? And started declaring, it's already within me. That's when everything shifted. Heaven didn't stand because you received a miracle. Heaven stood because you became one. That last move you made wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about revelation. You realized that the same power you once prayed to see was already breathing in your spirit. You had been asking for doors, not knowing you were the key. That awareness broke something open in the unseen. The moment you remembered who you are, the atmosphere around you began to rearrange itself in recognition. You became living evidence that divine answers don't always arrive. Sometimes they awaken. You stopped searching for saviors and started walking in the solution. Every obstacle became an opportunity to express what was already written in your DNA. You started operating with quiet confidence, knowing you weren't waiting on help. You were walking as help. That shift terrified darkness and thrilled heaven at the same time. Angels didn't stand because they pitied your struggle. They stood because they witnessed your awakening. You remembered your assignment, your worth, your voice, and your divine capacity. You became the embodiment of the prayer you once whispered in tears. Heaven's ovation wasn't for what you found, but for what you finally recognized, that your existence itself is an answer to something eternal. You stopped asking for change and started being it. And when you moved with that awareness, creation responded. You didn't arrive, you activated. You didn't meet destiny, you remembered it. That's when heaven rose to its feet. Every realm felt it. That sacred ripple that came the moment you decided to move differently. You didn't just change direction, you changed dimension. Every hidden act of obedience, every quiet surrender, every unannounced victory became a message to heaven that the assignment had been accepted. You walked through storms, silence, and self-denial, not to prove your strength, but to prove your alignment. The angels didn't stand because you were perfect. They stood because you were faithful. This journey wasn't about survival. It was about succession, passing the test that most people never finish. You faced delays that felt endless, pain that felt personal, and exposure that could have crushed you. But instead of breaking, you built. You turned pain into power, silence into strategy, stillness into strength. You didn't fight back with noise. You fought forward with purpose. Every time you chose restraint over revenge, truth over ego, purpose over popularity, heaven wrote it down as victory. Your life became proof that real greatness isn't loud, it's rooted. You moved when heaven moved. You said yes when it hurt. You waited when it felt unfair. You rose without announcement and forgave without closure. That's divine authority at work. Not the kind that demands to be seen, but the kind that's undeniable even in shadows. Heaven's standing ovation wasn't for one grand act. It was for every hidden decision that led you here. You are the evidence that alignment changes everything. You didn't just survive seasons, you translated them into wisdom. You became the embodiment of revelation, the proof that God doesn't waste process. The storm didn't expose your weakness, it confirmed your weight. You are walking testimony that the chosen aren't lucky, they're obedient. So keep walking in that light. Keep moving with that quiet fire. The applause from heaven is not just for what you've done, it's for what's still being written through you. If this message spoke to your spirit, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of who they are. Stay tuned, stay aligned, and never forget, heaven is still watching, and it's still standing for you. Stay blessed always.